Hi everyone, I wanted to make a video. I haven't made a video for a while. Firstly, to reassure some people that I'm not sick or dead. I'm fine, thanks to all my friends on Quora who have expressed some concerns about me not writing anything for a while. There's a number of reasons for that, one of which is just my work as a GP got quite busy with a few people on holidays, and also I'm trying to work on some music, which hopefully will be done through next year, but it's a big project. And yeah, I just need to prioritize things a little bit better sometimes. So I'll be infrequent in my writings in the next while, I expect. But I have been asked a really excellent question that I wanted to have a good old-fashioned rant on. John Richardson asked me, to what extent do freedom and equality conflict? I love talking about freedom as an abstract concept. I love pointing out the paradox, what I consider to be a paradox of equality. And I really wanted to do this as a personal presentation, as a talk video like this, because one of the themes that I want to get at is most people experience me on Quora as text, as a whole lot of words, which obviously are subject to interpretation. And one of the really fascinating things about text is that they lack a degree of personality, especially in their lack of tone, in their lack of inflection, in all these sort of funny things that I'm doing with my voice and my body, which convey a lot of intentionality, I think. So when you're watching this video, anyone who's used to reading what I write, this is how I talk much of the time, if I'm excited at least. And today's a good day and this is an exciting topic because freedom versus equality is really the essential problem of ontology and epistemology. What I want to suggest is that the concept of freedom and the concept of equality are actually completely opposed to one another. There is no sense in which these can be conflated. There is no way in which these are agreeable in one another's terms. And I think that's profound. The reason I think this is because we consider these two concepts as essential to human society, to the way that we experience ourselves and the way we experience others and the way that we interact. And we assume that these two things should not be completely independent, that they should be able to be mixed. But actually they can't, and that is what produces a number of our interesting problems of social interactions, but also a number of our interesting problems of theory and philosophy. So I want to look at three basic sort of elements to these issues. One is the one of domains, limits, and definitions. What we mean when we use terms and make reference to things, the problem of translation, the problem of how meaning is conferred, how truth is conveyed, problems of logic that amount to inference and implication. And I want to talk about the use of standards, the use of measures, and this incredible problem of arbitration. So, domains, limits, and definitions. When we talk about freedom, am I free to define freedom? If I am, then that definition is not necessarily evident in any way, because if you apply some definition, you limit a concept. You have to. When you count something, when you point out something, when something is identified in any way, there is a necessary limitation to the domain of reference, and there are properties that are ascribed to that definition and to that identity. Sorry, there are properties that are ascribed to that identity which constitute the definition. So when we talk about freedom, there's a wonderful irony that we have to limit that. We need to say what freedom is not. We need to say, when we speak of freedom, we are not referring to all these other things. These are the things that freedom is not free to apply to, which I just think is a very fun sort of problem to grapple with, that freedom itself is not infinite. It can't be, because if it were, you can't identify it. There would be no way in which that freedom could be communicated. There's no way it could be encapsulated or captured. There's no sense in which it could be confined. But of course, it must be, because we have language which conveys freedom, doesn't it? Or does it? Similarly, when we talk about equality, the principle of equivalence is equivalently problematic to the question of freedom. And that is, in equivalence, you have two definitions which are identical. There must be. When I say that one is equal to one, or my left hand and my right hand are both hands, what I'm doing is deliberately ignoring necessary difference. Because if I were not to ignore that necessary difference, you would actually have one entity. And this is Leibniz's law, that if you have two objects, two concepts, two properties, two identities that share all properties, if they are entirely equal, if they are perfectly equivalent, then you actually have one identity. You don't have two things. There is no way in which you could have two things. And that presents a whole lot of problems in ontology when we go to talk about numbers, shapes, the concepts that we use to describe any parts of the physical universe. We necessarily need to use equivalence in order to simplify our domain of reference, what we're talking about. Because if I were to say, actually, every point in the universe obviously is independent of all other points, and thus you have an infinite number of geographical or spatial addresses. When you then go to talk about any particle, any sort of participatory object in that space, there is no way in which any two objects can be entirely identical. Their spatial their spatial positions must be different. Otherwise, you have this conflation of identities and objects. So are any hydrogen nuclei actually perfectly equivalent? Well, no, they're not, and they can't be, because if they were, then nuclear magnetic resonance wouldn't work. When we use NMR with the basis of magnetic resonance imaging, we're relying on the surrounding context to every hydrogen nucleus to resonate with respect to its surroundings. That's what produces the differences in the image. That's what produces contrast. So, if we actually have equality, true equality, absolute equality, perfect equality, you have no contrast. You cannot have difference. Difference and equality are completely opposite concepts. And similarly, freedom, which is equivalent to some other freedom, well, actually, no, that means it's bound. That means if we say, my freedom in this way, in this, according to these properties, is equivalent to this other freedom, well, actually, you've got a definition that's dependent upon another definition. It's not free of it. It's not individual. It's bound. It's actually tethered. So when we talk about having the same freedoms, that's a limitation on freedom. One that I actually personally agree with from a practical perspective. But from a theoretical perspective, it's impossible. We cannot have freedoms that are limited, or freedoms that are defined by other freedoms, or even definitions of freedom that are consistent in their usage, without those being oppositions to the notion itself. And so if one thing is equal to another, that one thing is dependent on the other thing, and those things are limited by those definitions, their domains are restricted, they are no longer free. Degrees of freedom, when infinite, produce a problem whereby you cannot identify anything. Only nothing has infinite degrees of freedom, because only nothing is undefined. Okay? I love talking about the definition of nothing, and that's just another rant for another time. So, second point. When we use language to limit these concepts, when we use words that somehow exert a sphere of influence that limits the domain to which we're referring, we come across a very interesting problem. When we talk about liberty, for example, is that the same as freedom? Whenever we use any synonym, whenever we use any metaphor, is there a transfer of meaning that is true? So metaphorein, the Greek for to transfer, does that actually occur? Is there a movement? Is there a metastate whereby that meaning is preserved? And how? So when we look at the word liberty, derived from the Latin libertas, we'd imagine, and libertas can be translated freedom. Are liberty and freedom the same thing? If they are, why are there different words? Similarly, equality versus egalite, using a French synonym, is it the same? Is it really? Because if it were, it could not be defined differently, and it actually could not belong to different languages, because different languages have different domains of reference and different implications and inferences. Inferences are limited to languages. You cannot infer some meaning in English from a Japanese sentence using Japanese, because Japanese is not English. And there are these wonderful examples in all languages, I imagine, I'm not sure, that are untranslatable. These I think of as sort of like Gödelian sort of sentences that are not provable. If we consider my favorite example being the French je ne sais quoi, which when literally translated, of course, means I do not know. And even that I don't think is a particularly good translation. But of course, I'm just projecting my interpretation of French words, which I hardly use. I'm not French and I've not grown up in the French language. I'm just projecting my interpretation of a borrowed phrase in English to those words. But je ne sais quoi, of course, gets translated a certain something, or a particularity, or an idiosyncrasy. And I think that's beautifully ironic, that we're using a phrase that means literally, I do not know, to talk about something that we do know, we just can't say. Je ne sais quoi. Can it be translated truthfully? Similarly, the word meaninglessness, can that be translated? Well, if it is, then it sure as heck doesn't mean what it is taken to refer to. Otherwise, it would be meaningless. And of course, irony, which I talk about way too much, the definition of irony must be ironic, especially if it's not. So the problem that we have in translation is how equality actually operates in terms of epistemology, in terms of how things are known to be truthful when they're different. Can you really have different things that are the same? Well, sort of. Sort of. And of course, sort of means no, because otherwise it would be yes. But when we do any sort of translation, when we do any sort of evaluation, when we talk about equality, the way that we get around the problem of identity and the way that we bypass Leibniz's law effectively is we create a meta function. We create this situation in which we have some sort of Platonic ideal, like a number, which is both and neither. Okay? So if I say, here's a hand and here's a hand, they're both hands, this concept which is able to encapsulate both of them, even though they are clearly different, is hand, right? Hand, hand, both hands. Well, of course, when we're talking about hands, that ideal is separated from any example of a hand. All numbers are examples of number without necessarily being the concept itself. They cannot fully capture it. It's just like all words cannot possibly capture the meaning of language. And so when we're talking about equality, we have this problem whereby we have to make something up. We actually have to put something between. We need to have this virtual sort of ideal separate state, in fact a completely separate world, which is able to represent two things which cannot be married. Okay? I have a whole lot of thoughts on this, but really the word that I like to use to grasp at what we're trying to refer to there is this hypostasis, the situation whereby you have this joining, this a marriage, a fusion, a sort of chimerization, if you will. One thing made out of two. And of course, I'm starting to slip into some biblical language there. Two becoming one, this really beautiful and quite mysterious sense in which even human reproduction is exemplified by two things: losing their identity in a way that preserves it, and producing a new thing, which is both and neither. Of course, all sexual reproduction and all hybridization shows us that you really can have two things become one and have one thing that is both and neither. And of course, that goes against a lot of our logical divisions. So in this hypostasis of freedom and equality, we have this problem of limitation and of definition, whilst also maintaining the lack thereof. And of course, you cannot have anything that is perfectly free and yet fully equal. And yet we do, in the form of standards, rulers, arbitrary measures. This is how the whole of quantification works, by the use of something, and I always like to point out the meter. When the meter used to be a platinum bar that was in Paris, that meter actually had no length. It's a very, very esoteric idea, but because that platinum bar served as the meter, because that was the reference standard to which all lengths, using the SI units, referred, it itself actually didn't have a measure of its length, because it was the measure. And I think that's a thing that it's difficult to grapple with. Of course, we can use alternative standards. We can just switch to some imperial system. We can talk about Planck lengths. We can use any cookie cutter that we want to try and divide up what we're trying to talk about into equal incidences. But of course, really, there's only one standard. And when we use standards, those are serving as things that are completely free. They're independent of the metric they impose. So the meter isn't really a meter long, it's the meter. But similarly, they establish an equality. They are equal to the thing that they are making like themselves in a way. And this is why I like to meditate on this idea of the hypostasis, an old theological problem that was fought about for ages, particularly around the 400s. And it refers to this problem in Christian theology whereby Jesus cannot be both God and man. That obviously produces this same type of problem of an infinite deity that is not bound in any way necessarily, and a man that is somehow able to represent mankind. How does that even happen? How can you have a person that is all people in some sense? And yet arbitrary standards, our numbers, our metrics that we use day in, day out, operate exactly like this. They are completely free of what we use them for, and yet they establish the equality that we then apply in our basic use of logic. This operator is the same operator whether you use it in this context or that context, and the notation proves that. Even though one written on this side of the page and one written on that side of the page cannot in reality, in the way that we are trying to apply these virtual platonic ideal concepts to the real world, they cannot be the same any more than a left hand can be the same as a right hand. Okay, so the only solution to this freedom versus equality essential hypostatic conflict is rulers as rulers. The same word having different functions which have different implications whilst being equal but free of each other. Are there any standards that speak for themselves? Are there numbers that define number? Are there words that tell us what words are? Not really. Not really. You would need a self-aware standard. You would need some sort of bar of meat platinum saying, I'm a bar of platinum that's a meter long. And I decide that. And I can say that for myself. I don't need any language or any other person or property standing in my stead to operate as I do, to convey my effect. It's exactly what people do when they speak of people. As a person, I can say what a person is, but only because I'm a person. And this is what everyone else does, even though nobody else is me. So in my personal freedom, as an entity that is entirely unique, and in my semi-manic state can decide what properties I have, in a way, I have the freedom to define other people. Do I? Does that make any sense at all? It does, within my domain of reference and my domain of inference, my domain of activity that is relevant. But of course, other people regard that as not necessarily indicative of anything, not meaningful. My definition is not equal to their definition of themselves, of anything. If we were to sit down and debate the definition of freedom, isn't that an ironic thing to do? If we were to sit down and debate the definition of equality, shouldn't both the definitions be equal? And yet they can't be, because different people are not the same. That sounds so platitudinal, but of course it's completely true, whilst being completely false, because if that's true, then there's no way in which we can talk about we. There are no groups, there are no properties that unify people in any sense, there are no people, there is only person. And that's solipsism in a nutshell. We should talk to Clement Bessemer about that. But effectively, if we had an arbitrary standard, a standard that was able to arbitrate, a standard which was able to confer its own properties onto other things such that they were made like itself, and in that activity those were given their value, then we would have a perfect logical system whereby things could be measured truly and consistently. But as it stands, each of those are actually invented. We make them up. We have to, because if we don't, they don't apply to anything other than themselves. All definitions become tautologies that don't have any rules of influence. You can't have a tautology, I am what I am, me, I, any sort of declaration of identity that applies only to itself. You cannot have a tautology that relates to any other thing. Because if it does, then it's not tautologous, it's not actually self-definitive. There's an open end to the logic which must be self-referential. So in every sense where our definition of freedom is self-referential, that definition is an echo chamber. It produces a scenario whereby we are constrained by ourselves, and that constraint limits us from applying to anyone else. And it's an ironic problem. Similarly, when we look at equality, that definition of equality must apply generally, must apply equally, have no divisions within it. And yet, of course, once that occurs, you actually are referring to nothing in particular. You're referring to everything. Everything is one, and we run into this problem of monism. So, in summary, the only solution to the essential conflict of freedom and equality is an arbitrary standard that speaks for itself. Who shall speak? Who shall say, I am the one who decides. I am the one who values. Because in doing so, whenever we make ourselves the judge in that way, with the measure you use, so shall it be measured unto you. This wonderful problem of becoming the measure that defines not only itself, but its entire sphere of reference, reflects back on us, such that we are not free to define both ourselves and others, and neither can it be equal for any of us to do so. But I suggest that there is a solution in a person who, of course, is, as some Christians would say, both present and actual and separate and virtual and extant in language and not a participatory part of the real world whilst simultaneously being so. Have a good day.